Hello from New Zealand and welcome to our presentation on Race Yourselves, a longitudinal exploration of self-competition between past, present, and future performances in a VR Exergame. I'm Alex Michael and Christof Lutteroth is my co-author for this paper. Before we get into the Exergaming research, it's important to set the scene. And the problem that we're really trying to tackle here is sedentary behavior, which is a big problem. It's one of the leading causes of preventable death worldwide, and it places huge economic burden for healthcare systems because of all of the related chronic illnesses related to sedentary behavior, such as obesity. And a lot of evidence has accumulated to show that sedentary behavior is also strongly associated with anxiety and depression, which is fueling the mental health crisis. And unfortunately, sedentary behavior is especially problematic during lockdown situations in which many of ourselves are in right now. So what's the antidote to sedentary behavior? Well, it's exercise. Problem solved, right? No. If only it was that easy. All of us know that exercise is good for us. It makes us healthier, it improves our mood, but so many of us just don't do it. Many of us are professional exercise avoiders. And going from sedentary lifestyle to one which has regular, sustained physical activity requires behavior change. And the problem with that is behavior change is very hard to do. And when it comes to exercise, there are many obstacles along the way. For example, the most commonly cited reason why people don't exercise is perceived lack of time. People just don't think they have enough time for exercise or for going to the gym. The second one being lack of self-motivation, and perhaps the reason why this is that it's just human nature to avoid discomfort, and exercise isn't necessarily the most comfort-inducing activity there is. But perhaps the biggest barrier that we have to tackle is thinking that exercise is not enjoyable. If you don't find exercise enjoyable, there's a very low chance that you're going to continue to do it. And indeed, the number one predictor of sustained behavior change is if that behavior is intrinsically motivating. That is, do you do the activity for its own inherent satisfaction and enjoyment? And for many people, exercise does not fit the bill. So we need to come up with a way to make exercise more enjoyable. And one of the ways we can do this is through exergaming, where exergaming is the combination of exercise and gaming, where exercise is the side effect of playing a game. And you can use immersive technologies like virtual reality to really enhance the experience. And the idea behind exergaming is that if games are so fun and so successful, why not just make exercise the game? Well, you could argue that we actually already do this, and we do it through something known as sport. Whether it's a team sport like rugby, a single-player sport like tennis, a racing sport like cycling or running, exercise is obviously a big part of each of these. It's a part of every single sport there is, at least a physical sport. And each of these sports have a common theme between them. It's not just that there is exercise, but there is competition. And if we look at competition, we find that it's very thrilling for athletes and that there are a lot of exciting emotions involved, such as excitement, hope, stress, fear, elation. Winning a very hard-fought race feels euphoric, and you get the shared experience by going through the same sort of emotions as your fellow competitors. And we know for a fact that it's very motivating for athletes. And indeed, athletes train to win. So, of course, it plays a big factor for them here. But competition isn't for everyone. What happens if you're not really fit or you're just not a competitive person? Well, there's a huge amount of literature suggesting that competition can have detrimental effects on these types of people in terms of their intrinsic motivation. For example, losing sucks as well. So let's not ignore that. Losing is not a fun emotion. And cognitive evaluation theory posits that it's hard to enjoy an activity if you don't feel you're good at it. So if you're not really fit, you're not going to really do well in a sports competitive situation. So these are important barriers to competition. So the problem that we're trying to tackle here is, can we make the positive racing experience accessible to those who are less fit and less competitive? And the way we're approaching this problem is to rethink the idea of competition itself, and using Exergames as our method to do this. So if you think about it, competition has always meant competing against others. Whether it's a single-player sport or a team sport, you always compete against someone else. But what would it be like if you could compete against yourself? Or better yet, what would it be like if you could compete against yourselves? Well, in our Exergame, competing against yourselves would look something like this. So, race yourselves. The way our game works is that we use multiple ghosts to allow players to compete against their performance history. And the way this works is that every time the player goes through the game, we record their performance and we play it back to them as a competitor. And we simply just repeat this process every time they play the game so that they are able to compete against their performance history. They are able to compete against their past. Similarly, we also allow players to compete against their predicted future performance using a psychological training technique known as feed-forward. And feed-forward is basically the present self learning from the future self. So the way we did this in the Exergame is to create a ghost which was slightly faster than the player's best performance to date, and sort of have that as a target for what their future performance might be like. So in this way, we have ghosts that allow self-competition between past, present, and future performances. So to investigate the effect of this competitive dynamic, we posed the following research questions. The first one being, how effective is multi-ghost competition in improving exercise performance over time? Number two, how does multi-ghost competition affect psychological predictors of exercise adherence over time? And thirdly, how does it compare to non-competitive gameplay? The experiment conditions that we set out in our experiments were the following. The multiple ghost condition, or MG, in which, as I said before, each session adds a new ghost, and the future ghost is the player's best performance, split up to be 5% faster than average. On average. And secondly, the non-competition NC condition, in which, as it says, there's no competition, there's no ghost, and every Exergaming session is identical. The exercise protocol that we used in our Exergame was HIIT, or high intensity interval training. We used a 5-minute HIIT protocol where players go from about a minute of low intensity cycling to 30 seconds of all-out cycling, back to low-intensity cycling, and then another bout of 30 seconds of intense cycling, and so on and so forth until the end. To evaluate our Exergame, we conducted 2 studies. The first one being a longitudinal study that was between participants. So we had a group. We had half the participants be in the multiple ghost group, and the other half of the participants be in the non-competition group. Each group having 12 participants, but one participant in the NC group dropped out due to VR motion sickness. And the players played the game over a 4-week period, twice a week. After the longitudinal study was completed, we did a cross-sectional study that was within participants, the same participants in the longitudinal study, and each player played the Exergame under both conditions so that they were able to make a direct comparison between the two. So in terms of the results, how did multi-ghost competition improve performance over time? Well, if we look at the NC group, they increased their performance by around 8% at the end of the study compared to their first session. And this is generally on par with non-gamified HIIT, in which improvements in a slightly longer time period, say to around 6 to 8 weeks, they generally improve between the range of 5 to 10%. However, for the multiple ghost group, they actually doubled their performance improvement, and so they got 16% faster. They were 16%. They were able to generate 16% more power by the end of the exergaming session of the intervention compared to their first session. And this is quite a substantial improvement, and it suggests that racing yourselves can be an effective way of increasing performance over a relatively short period of time. So this was a rather promising result. In terms of how does multi-ghost affect psychological predictors of exercise adherence over time, we found that compared to NC, MG was able to increase intrinsic motivation, increase perceived competence, and players invested a lot more effort into the Exergame compared to those in NC. So this is quite an interesting finding, because not only did participants in MG work a lot harder than those in NC, at the same time they also were more intrinsically motivated by the task. And indeed, if you sub-analyze the data, we found that those who ranked lower in terms of their competitiveness found the game more intrinsically motivating and more satisfying compared to those who are more competitive against others. In terms of how multi-ghost competition compares to non-competitive gameplay, well, we found in almost virtually every single metric we measured, multi-ghost competition was superior to no competition. And when asked, all players unanimously preferred MG over NC. We also conducted a thematic analysis of our qualitative data, and we identified the 4 following themes. The first one being, I am getting better and better. And this was largely due to participants being able to clearly visualize and make concrete appraisals that they were definitely, over time, they were beating their past performances and doing better over time. The second theme being, I worked very hard to win. Participants in MG were very motivated to best their past performances, and indeed they were very motivated to try to do better than their future performance, and so they invested a lot of effort in the exercise task. And the qualitative findings match with the quantitative findings, where scores for perceived exertion, effort, and heart rates were higher than those in NC. Furthermore, outperforming my ghost feels rewarding. Being able to clearly visualize their progression over time, that they were doing better and better, beating their ghosts, beating sometimes even their future ghosts, that was a very rewarding part of the experience. And it showed that they were going in the right track. They were getting better over time. But conversely, this leads to losing to the ghosts feeling very frustrating, precisely because you're doing worse than a previous performance, and it suggests that you're going in the wrong direction. And indeed, some participants were so invested into even beating their future ghosts that while they beat their past performances, losing to their future ghosts was also a source of frustration. The potential implications of our findings suggest that we can make competition and its benefits accessible to non-competitive people. We can improve enjoyment, performance, and adherence to HIIT, which is currently a major challenge. And we could also help people who struggle with setting realistic exercise goals by having them compete against themselves. So in conclusion, racing yourselves can be an effective method for improving player performance over time. It can improve predictors of exercise adherence, and it can convey some of the excitement of a real race. And it's generally preferred over non-competition. So that's the end of our presentation. If you have any questions about our research, feel free to contact us. and I hope you stay safe.